Anybody can tell a story. Ask any parent who's listened to a 4-year-old recap a movie. But what makes us storytellers? For Brantley Hightower, an architect who you'd expect to tell stories in steel and stone, it's an unquenchable curiosity. His podcasts go beyond the what to the much more interesting why at the heart of every story. Welcome to BexarCast. I'm Randy Langford, and this is BexarCast, a weekly interview with business, political, educational, and nonprofit leaders. We're examining the relationships between all four and how each one benefits from the success of the other three. Brantley Hightower received his Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Texas at Austin in 2000, and a post-professional Master's of Architecture degree from Princeton University in 2006. He's taught at the University of Texas at Arlington, Texas Tech, Trinity, and the University of Texas at Austin. He's also a regular contributor to Texas Architect magazine. He's the founder of HighWorks, and his first book, The Courthouses of Central Texas, was published by the University of Texas Press in 2015. Brantley, thanks for joining me. Thanks for being here.
Hello, good to be here.
Tell me about your podcast. Tell me about the San Antonio Storybook.
Yeah, so it's a podcast done in collaboration with the Rivard Report, so
Right.
Online news outlet here in town. And the intent is to tell some of the stories behind things we know about in San Antonio that are unique to San Antonio, but maybe don't necessarily know the story behind it.
Right.
So, for example, our sort of premiere episode from a year ago, we took, there's that cannon that gets fired at Fort Sam Houston every morning at 6:30. And, I live probably about 5 miles north of that. I hear it every morning.
Right, yeah.
And, I've heard it for decades and just sort of kind of wondered, well, what is the story behind that? And so, that is an example. Others, we sort of just kind of looked into the history or the story behind the people and places that make San Antonio such a unique place.
Have you always been a storyteller? Is this something you've done since your youth, or how did this come to be?
To the degree that we are all storytellers, you meet someone and they ask who you are and what you do, you're telling
Right.
the story at that point. For me, I'm trained as an architect. And while you can make the argument that good buildings tell a story or provide a frame for us to create our own stories, it really started my first job out of college. So I went to undergrad at the University of Texas at Austin, moved up to Chicago because I wanted to live in a big city with winter and stuff. And there's a lot of cool stuff you get to do as an architect. There's a lot of kind of boring, mundane stuff that you can do whilst listening to music or the radio. And so this was in early 2000s. Shows like This American Life on public radio program. Right. Sort of starting to get their legs and creating a different type of storytelling, of sort of narrative journalism. And so I pretty religiously listened to that. And this was before podcasts. So this was when you'd either have to listen to a specific time,
right,
to hear the actual program, or you could, I don't know if you remember this, but do you remember Real Player, the little sort of app you would open on your Windows computer that allowed you, while connected to your actual computer, to listen to past broadcasts. So things are still pretty crude. And I thought, man, it'd be fun to do this. And I looked into a little bit, but, back then you had, digital audio recorders and, editing was not really computer-based yet. So the barriers for entry were pretty high, both in terms of the cost of the equipment and just sort of access to the technology. Right. And over the next, 2 decades or so, that flipped considerably. So that now pretty much any computer you buy is going to have some sort of music or audio editing software. For Mac, it's GarageBand, and I know there's similar free programs for PCs. And, a good microphone. Honestly, you have everything you need on your phone in terms of getting raw audio and then being able to process it. And so, fast forward to 2015, I'm back in San Antonio, back in Texas, working as an architect. I have my own firm, doing a lot of grunt work still because it's a one-person operation. And I guess 2014, I believe, was right when the iPhone introduced its podcast app, and there's kind of a tipping point where suddenly it was a thing, and I would listen to many of these podcasts, and I thought, yeah, like some stories that I think would be interesting to tell. Every building is kind of a story as far as how it got built, why it got built. And so in 2015, I started or launched, I guess, my first podcast, which was basically that, telling stories about the world we build around us. And because I live in San Antonio, I found that a lot of my stories were about San Antonio in particular. So that was kind of the pitch I made to the Rivard Report in 2018 that, hey, I'm already telling stories about San Antonio. Let's codify that into a podcast specifically about San Antonio, which is the scope of what the Rivard Report is. So it was a kind of circuitous path.
It all makes sense.
And the point in all that I am not a trained journalist. So that is not where my background is. And while I've done writing for architectural writing, it's been text-based. And what I've discovered is that it's like reading a book and then watching the movie adaptation of the book. The two media is very different, and you can tell stories in one medium that are different, that have advantages versus telling them in another. And that's one thing I've come to really enjoy, especially when it comes to talking about buildings, which you normally think of as having this visual component. That as soon as you take away a photo of a building, which you can look at and say, oh, I like that building, or I don't, it's ugly, it's beautiful, whatever. As soon as you remove sort of the aesthetics, then you can sort of get to more of the core of the story and come to appreciate a building or a place, regardless of if you think it's pretty or not.
Right. Yeah, I count on people not being able to see me when they judge me. So
I've got the perfect face for radio, I like to say.
Me too, right. The stories you tell lend themselves to a historical avenue. Have you always been a history buff?
It's a good question. Yeah, I would say so. My wife and I always joke that I tend towards the nonfiction in my reading, which I guess there is sort of a historical component regardless. Whereas she's more sort of the fiction story standpoint. But I mean, one of the things I find fascinating about, again, this sort of narrative journalism is that it's sort of combining the two. So you're finding these stories or crafting these stories out of what could be, fairly dry, Wikipedia articles in many cases. It's what is the cannon boom that you hear every morning in San Antonio? I could answer that in a sentence, or I could tell the larger background of the story of the military in San Antonio and sort of give you a greater understanding of sort of the larger truth than a simple answer to a simple question.
Yeah, there's a pretty straightforward answer to that, but then there's the story behind the story. Absolutely. So this was your first year to participate in BexarCast, and I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that, how you felt about it and what you observed. And you kind of took a double dip. You were one of the presenters at the Tech Day when we gave the students participating in BexarCast an inch-deep overview on the various media that are part of BexarCast, and you took the lead on the podcast element. And this was the first year BexarCast has had podcasting, that it's been a part of the festival. And so some of the feedback I got from the coaches and the students was, we're glad you added that, but we've never done it before. So it was an opportunity. It was an excuse for us to kind of dip our toe in those waters. You were also a judge at the end of the cycle, and got to see and hear what the kids had produced. What were your expectations going into BexarCast, and did they change?
That's a good question. I really didn't know what to expect because I feel like and this is true of any generation, the younger one is always going to be infinitely more tech savvy than you. And so well, I'd like to think of myself as fairly young and fairly tech savvy. I know compared to people half my age, that's not going to be the case at all. And
to a 17-year-old, you're ancient.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't feel ancient, but I guess I kind of am at this point. But as far as the technical acumen and just sort of being able to figure out sort of the software and how to record and how to get that into the computer, I mean, I assume that would be relatively straightforward. And it's not that it's easy; it's something you can figure out. You can watch on YouTube, you can do the research, and it's designed to be intuitive. Programs like GarageBand are. But it was the craft that takes a little bit more time to sort of figure out. I mean, how do you tell a story? How much information do you give? A big part of what I find I do in crafting my scripts is writing so that it doesn't sound like what I'm saying is written. There is a flow to the conversation that we're having now because we're not, in fact, reading the script. And if you listen to NPR, if you listen to most of the good podcasts, they have that quality to them, even though in most cases they are in fact reading a prepared script because there is a desire to deliver information efficiently and quickly, while at the same time having the quality of sort of a conversation. And so, I don't know the degree to which kids used a script. But by and large, they handled that pretty well. The more I think sort of successful entries were the ones that took advantage of the specifics of the medium, which is to say, it's an audio medium. It's all based on sort of what you can hear. So, integrating music if the organization that you're interviewing or focusing on has an audio component to it. Use that jumping off point. And I think that's true for most good radio stories you listen to, is they have some strong audio component, which is hard because not every story does. If you're doing a podcast about the mime industry, it's going to be a way to get
a long day
audio in there, right? And that becomes part of the challenge. Is finding a way to make to paint a picture in your mind using just sound.
Right. And that was kind of where we were going by adding the podcast element to the festival, was to give those kids that are interested in that, the theater of the mind, giving them an opportunity, giving them a place to stretch their wings. One of the goals of BearFest is there's a lot of goals, but one of them is to give students a real world work experience, to put them in front of a client. And a lot of these kids are dealing with adults for the first time on a adult to adult level. In the past, it's always been parent child, teacher student, but now it's vendor client. And we put them in that situation deliberately to, okay, here's what it's going to be like. The first time you talk to an adult as a peer shouldn't be on your first job interview. You should have a chance to do that before that. We want them to get those, not only that real world skills, but what people refer to as soft skills: time management, resource allocation, conflict resolution, communications, all that. And we do that in BearFest, we do it through media, the production of media, but those skills apply to any field. And as an architect, you tell me, how important is communications? How important is resource allocation? Are kids learning things at BearFest that they can take to any field?
Absolutely, yeah. All those things are really critical just to any project-based profession. I mean, whether it's, and I often like to say that architecture as a profession is all about resource management. And yes, that could be, from a sustainability standpoint, how do we allocate finite resources? But one of those resources is time. One of those is money. And so for any given project, getting from a blank sheet of paper to an architecture of building and podcasting, an audio file, a video, QuickTime video, all those are the skill set you have for that is applicable to a variety of different end results. And so, making that transition from I have a vague idea of what I want to do, and this is the direction I want to pursue, to actually making that first step, creating that
Right.
that script, creating the crafting the audio based on sort of interviews, giving up some of the things that, man, I really thought I was going to be able to do this, but the tape wasn't good enough or the interview didn't go there, and saying, okay, I'm not going to be able to do that, but hey, here's this other direction I can go that can be, super interesting as well.
Yeah, look what I wasn't expecting.
And I'm always interested or fascinated by the parallels between the work I do as a podcaster and the work I do as an architect, in the ways that they are similar, in the ways that they are different. They are similar in that, it's always a compromise. It's always sort of dealing with what you have, whether it's tape or a site that's maybe not great, or a very short turnaround on a schedule, or a budget that's maybe not, as large or as robust as you would like. One thing I do like about podcasting that is very different than designing a building is that, you can turn around the turnaround is much quicker, right? You're not spending years, or you are spending years designing and building a building. Whereas a podcast, you turn one around in a couple of weeks, depending on the scale and ambition. So there is something, and I think everyone who's participated in this program, wants to create stuff in the world. And it is incredibly compelling and exciting to be able to do that. But it's nice to get that feedback a little bit, a little shorter time frame.
Yeah, you don't have to wait for 30 years to understand, was that a hit or not? Well, Brantley, thank you so much. I appreciate your participation in BearFest. One of the things that I am a firm believer is that as adults, we are all role models, whether we want to be or not. Kids are watching. And so you stepped up and provided some leadership for these kids, and I appreciate that. And look forward to having you back again next year, participating again.
I look forward to it. Thanks for the conversation. We'll see you in I guess 2021.
Yeah, we'll be back.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
You too.